Welcome to Social Studies Samurai. In this video, we'll talk about how to respond to the second question on the DP History exam for Paper 1, more specifically, Question 10 for Move to Global War. And we'll use Japan as our example. This is the source analysis question, or the OPCVL, and we'll talk all about that and how to respond to the question. So let's get started. Okay everyone, so this is how to answer the second question on Paper 1 for DP History. Specifically, it's how to answer Question 10 for Move to Global War. But any Paper 1 second question, this is how you do it. Before we move on, we have to understand origin, purpose, content, values, and limitations. So the origin. Well, the origin's actually found in the description of the source, right? You'll see that at the top. You want to talk about the type of source it is. Is it a speech? Is it a book? You want to also add who created it, who said it, who wrote it, who drew it, who recorded it. It could be an historian, politician, biographer. It could be a business person or an industrialist. Maybe it could be a homemaker. You just never know. It could be a number of different people. You have to talk about when it was made. Is it contemporaneous, meaning was it something created at the time the event was happening? Or was it after the event? When it was made is really, really important. Where was it made? That's important. Different part of the world, a specific part of a country. It could be, it could mean that there's a bias in the location, or it could mean there's an assumed perspective. The country that it was made, even the publishing company that made it. All of these are part of the origin. So the purpose. This is a little tricky. You have to derive the purpose from the description of the source as well as from the content of the source. So is the purpose, do you think, intended to inform people? Was it for scholarship or academics and education? Was it news for the public? Was the intention to disinform? So were facts deliberately altered perhaps or excluded? Was the intention to persuade people of a certain perspective or convince an audience that this idea is the right idea? Was there a deliberate effort to attempt to connect with an audience? That could be the citizens of a country, it could be a social class, or even an ethnic group. So the content. That's the text part. It's the source itself. It could be an image, of course, but for the Paper 1 exam, it'll be a text, a piece of text. It's not the origin and purpose. Sometimes students think that the origin and the purpose is actually the content. It's not. The content is the source itself and what's in it. And that can indicate a number of different things. It could show the author's point of view. It could be evidence from an event. It could be the interpretation of an event. And it can be many different things. It could be a speech, a letter, a law, a memoranda, a diary, a journal entry. Usually, it is an extract of something larger. Books, speeches, they're just too long. So, on the exam, you can only look at really an extract. So the values. The values really, it just means the usefulness to an historian, right? What can a historian learn from the source? Giving a value is making a judgment about how relevant or how useful the source is for the historian. So you have to identify what historians can learn or infer from the source, essentially. Is the creator an authority on the topic? So the origin could be an historian who is an expert in that topic in history. Is it an eyewitness account? That's a value of an origin. Somebody was there. Is the author addressing a specific audience? That's a value of the purpose. Is there some perspective, one or more perspective? That's content and purpose being given to you. Do we learn something about the event from the content? Do we learn about the circumstances, why an event kind of happened or what was going on, around the specific event? Are there statistics that might be useful? That's a value of the content, though we have to be careful. And does it provide hindsight? Was, the content created years and years after an event where the historian had more sources to use? So the limitations. Essentially, it's the opposite of the values. The limitations are things that limit the historian from understanding an event fully or understanding a person or a point of view, that kind of thing. A limitation could also be things that are not in the source. But you can't just say, well, it's not in the source, so it's a limitation. You can't just say something's not there. That's not a limitation. But you can look for things that are not there and explain them clearly to make it a limitation. So you're identifying the weakness, the things that hold the historian back from understanding. Was there a motive for making the source? Maybe the source is propaganda. That's a limitation of the origin. Was the author expressing one specific perspective? It's a limitation of the purpose. Was it produced to get a response from a specific group of people or an audience? That's a limitation of the purpose. Is it incomplete or details missing? Was something deliberately omitted? Limitation of the content. Is it subjective? Does it lack objectivity because it's exaggerated? Is the tone too negative or too positive? That could be a limitation of the content as well. So how do you respond to the question? The origin, the purpose, and the content all have values and limitations. Keep that in mind. So you have to examine the origin. Who made it? When did they make it? Why? Where? Well, not the why. The why is the purpose. So you have to infer the purpose from the origin, but also the content. So look at the overall content. Examine the origin and infer the purpose from the origin and the content. Maybe from the kind of source as well. Evaluate two values. This means you have to say what the value is and a value of what? Content, origin, purpose, and why that is a value. Explain it. Same thing for limitations. Evaluate two limitations. What are the limitations and why are they limitations? Explain it. Be sure to use relevant terminology. The origin of the source is, a value of the content is. Make sure you write in the past tense. This is very, very important. If you use bias, be sure to explain it very clearly. Something is biased. You can't just say it's biased. You have to explain it. So here's the response structure. Origin, you have to give a thorough description of the who, what, when, and where. Write this first. Then write the purpose. And this should be a reasonable explanation of why it was made and the intended audience. Again, you have to infer this from the origin and from the content. So use terms like, a possible reason. The values, you have to identify the origin, purpose, and content and say one of them is a value and give the explanation of why it's a value. We'll tell you how to write this in a minute. For limitations, the same thing. Identify an origin, purpose, or content and the limitation of it and an explanation of why. So how do you write this? So for the response structure, when you write it, keep it very simple. The origin of source I is, or the origin of the source is, and give your explanation of the origin. The purpose of the content was probably, again, keep it simple. A value of the origin is, a value of the content is, a limitation of the origin is, and a limitation of the content is. You want to be sure that you're giving your explanations of these. These are sentence starters for you, but they're not enough. You have to give the explanation and give good detail. And I recommend you write 2 paragraphs. Origin, purpose, and then the values, 2 of them, and then another short paragraph with 2 limitations, just to really separate your ideas. So here's the response structure. Pause the video a little bit. Have a look at number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Note how I've broken it down to, the origin of the source is the who, what, and the when. The purpose of the source was probably the why it was made in the audience. Note I've got what it is and then the explanation. Pause the video and look at that for a moment. Okay, here's some tips for you. Review your history notes. Always review your history notes. They will help you understand the source content better. Review an origin, purpose, values, and limitations chart before you do your exam or any tests. It's going to help remind you of what, values and limitations of a speech or a letter or a diary entry, that kind of thing might be. Or have a look at a values and limitations table. Always review. Understand the question first. That'll help you really focus on what your response should be. On the test paper, when you're allowed to, highlight, circle, and underline things. It'll be a quick reminder of what to write. Use the prompt terminology, origin, purpose, content, values, and limitations. And find 2 values and 2 limitations. Always do this, 2 and 2. And write in about 10 minutes. It's worth 4 points, so spend more time on the questions with greater point value. So what should you avoid? Be careful when you're explaining things like bias as a limitation. Something that's biased, yeah, that can be a limitation, but you have to explain why. Extracts as a limitation. Sure, we know something, if you don't have the whole document, then yeah, it's going to be a limitation. You have to explain why. We'll get to that later. There's no value or limitation in being a primary or a secondary source, so you can't say that, well, a limitation of the origin is that it's a secondary source. All sources have values and limitations. Don't rewrite the question. You're going to waste time. Don't write topic sentences and lengthy details. You're going to waste time. Don't repeat a value or a limitation because you're not going to get an extra point for repeating yourself. Don't use background knowledge. Don't use slang or colloquialisms. Don't speculate and don't give your opinion. You don't get value for that. You might actually lose points because it's not really relevant. Okay, so let's do some practice. This is question 2 on the paper 1 DP history exam. Specifically, move to global war, case study 1, Japan, and it's on the Manchurian crisis. So in a moment, when I show you the source, you'll want to pause the video, have a look at the source, and then write a response. And then we'll deconstruct it together. Okay, so here's your source. At the top, you can see the origin. You can see the question prompt, which is similar to all, second questions on the IB Paper 1 exam. Question 10 for move to global war. And then you have the source. So pause the video, write a response, and we'll deconstruct it in a moment. Okay, so here's a possible response. Maybe pause the video and read through it, and then we're going to look at it with some highlighted text, and I'll make some certain points. Remember, this is just a possible response. There could be other values and limitations that could be used, so it's really just one example. Okay, so let's deconstruct this just a little bit. Note in the green, I have the point that I'm trying to make, and in the violet or reddish color, I'm giving my justifications, my explanations. So note I've said the origin of the source is an extract from an academic book by a Japanese historian. These are important points of the origin. There are a few other things in there that are also important that you should write. Those are the key ideas. The purpose, probably written for scholarship and for a Japanese audience because it's a Japanese history book and written by a professional historian. So really it's probably for scholarship or education. Note a value of the origin. It's written by a professional historian, so they're probably authoritative. The source material might be more reliable because they're an expert. A value of the content. I've noted it's written in hindsight, well over 20 years after the end of the war, so the historian probably had access to more source material when they were doing research. Maybe they had access to Japanese sources as well, not just English language-based sources. A second paragraph, very short one, giving limitations. It separates it from the other stuff. Note I've given a limitation of the origin, which could be the historian, because they could have cultural bias and nationalism might have led to less objectivity. And they might present details in a less objective way. I've explained my bias in detail. A limitation of the content. It is an extract, so I've noted important details might be missing and that an historian might not get a full understanding of what actually happened because it's an extract. So this is kind of how you should be responding to the question. So that was how to answer question 10 for Move to Global War on the DP History Paper 1 exam, or the second question for any Paper 1 exam. Good luck, keep working at it, you're going to be fine. Thanks for watching the video. If you're a student or a teacher in subjects like history, geography, government, economics, check out some of the other videos. The mission of this channel is to help students build skills and teachers build their toolkit. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on the web at socialstudiessamurai.com. Hope to see you again.